Do you know a life-saving station like that? I'm glad you're here today. My name is Bob. I'm one of the pastors, and welcome to SMC. What a great day to be in the house of God and with God. Yes? Yeah, you bet. So if you were here last weekend, maybe you remember that I mentioned the world-famous Grater's ice cream from Cincinnati, Ohio. One of the best ice creams anywhere, and I can be a decent judge of that. So imagine what it was like a few days after last Sunday when UPS delivered to my front door. No kidding. Some Grater's ice cream. Be nice if, there we go, like a half a dozen of those. Can you imagine? Now this is the real deal. Now you can't see that, but that container has 1,189 calories. That's what it says right there. Now the reason I'm smiling is I'm not going to eat that, but I could. I mean, some of us could eat 2 of those, and that would be like 2 days of calories. 4 servings, they say. Yeah, right. No wonder it's so good. So I would share my good fortune with you. I would. But I've already given it all away to some of the luckiest SMC kids in all the world. They're going to be having a big time this weekend. And the reason I decided to give it to kids here in the church is because, well, most of you don't appreciate the finer things in life, like Grater's ice cream and Lexington barbecue. So be that as it may. So, now, some of you are brand new to SMC, and you're sitting there thinking, what's this got to do with anything? What's it got to do with church or God or the Bible or anything else? And it's very simple, so don't miss this. If my attitude toward this ice cream is, it's mine, came to my door and I'm not sharing it, then I wonder if maybe that attitude has developed all around us and has even prevailed in the church over the years. And it's quite frankly done some irreparable damage to our mission as a life-saving station and the future of the movement. If we look at each other at any point and we say, hey, this is my church and we do things around here just the way we like it and we're not changing, and we're not going to share it with anybody because, well, if we share it, then somebody might come along and mess it up. Met a family after one of our services about 3 weeks ago, and they've been watching our services online for several months, but it was the first time they'd been in the building, at least in person. They were sincere and forthright, and they said to me, hey, look, we've enjoyed very much the streaming services. And we've only missed a few in the past year, they said, but we never realized, even though we were watching the services on a big screen television, we didn't realize that the church is so big. And we just don't know how we might feel about attending a church as large as this one. I can understand that, can't you? Well, let me tell you something. Leading a church this size is not exactly a walk in the park either. But that might not be the right questions for us to ask. Instead of asking something like, how do we feel about participating or being volunteers or leading in a large church like this, maybe we should find out how God feels about it. A church that might be experiencing some growing pains and one that kind of stretches the leadership and the volunteers and those who serve and the resources and the facilities and even the future. This past Monday night, I needed to meet with the elders, and we couldn't find a space to meet. Now look, I mean, how cool is it to attend a church when the elders can't find any spare rooms around to have a meeting? So it's evident if you read, or when you read the Bible, especially if you read the stories in the book of Acts, ACTS, the book of Acts, which is the history of that very first church, that God wants the church to be a catalyst for lives to change and for people to, that church to open its arms for people to come to faith in Christ, his son. Look at how Peter summarized this. He said, God does not want anyone to be lost. Some people get really confused about that. God does not want anyone to be lost, but he wants all people to change their hearts and lives. We talk about that all the time around here, changed lives. It's why this church has occupied this small corner of planet Earth for the past 165 years. And our vision, crystal clear. We just want to be a place where people can come. They can explore a relationship with Christ at their own pace. And eventually, they might just be able to discover which one is leaving us. Brody. Well, that's because his sister made all the noise during the baptism. So I know, yep. Yeah. Go for it, Brody. What was I saying? We want people to come here and ultimately discover what does it mean to dig a foundation on which not only can we have an old church basement with 18-inch thick concrete foundations. It's amazing, that building over there. But we also don't want to forfeit our right to be a church if we hand over our responsibility as a life-saving station. When a church, let me tell you something, everybody, when a church forgets about their responsibility to be a part of God's saving lives, that church typically doesn't disband. In fact, to the contrary. They continue to have Sunday services, committee meetings. They create programs and share study groups, and they talk about life-saving stories from the past. But here's the catch. Their focus and their priorities have changed, and they're no longer scanning the horizon out there to see if there are other people who might need to be rescued. And instead, they spend most of their time and energy sort of looking at themselves, what they want, what they like, what makes them feel good. And I'll tell you, when a local church stops being a rescue station, insignificance is not very far behind. It's possible for any church to forget that Jesus has put the responsibility of search and rescue in the hands of a team of volunteers in a local church, not a group of seminary-trained professionals. What that mission is, if that mission is neglected, or if somehow we turn it loose and abandon it, it's just a matter of time before somebody might write these 3 letters on the doors of a church, FTT. Are you familiar with that? With that designation? Occasionally a child is born, and for no apparent reason, the child starts to decline almost immediately. And if there is not some serious attention given, then there's always a chance that this baby will not survive. There are times when a pediatrician will write on the child's chart, FTT, failure to thrive. And this was never God's plan for your life or for the life of his church. So if a church is not multiplying and increasing its impact, if they're not reaching people, influencing new disciples, if lives are not changing and new believers being baptized, something could be seriously broken in that church. And what can happen is then our sin nature begins to take over. And boy, I'll tell you, things can happen. We can become selfish and narcissistic, and we start to think only about ourselves. And we can even forget the whole reason why God has assembled his church in the first place, and that is to be a lighthouse. We never want the light to go out of the lighthouse. This is part 3 in a fall preaching series that we're just calling Birthmarks. So we're looking at some of those marks that this church was born with a long time ago, and some of the birthmarks that continue to make this church distinctive. And today we're gonna turn to the Old Testament book of 2 Kings. It's about 930 years before Jesus. This story has a lot to say about what God has called us to do when our expanding influence is seriously making Jesus famous. I've discovered a whole lot in my nearly 7 decades on this planet, but one of the greatest lessons that I've learned, at least since I started walking with Christ at the age of 17, is that it is hopeless to try to do life without the values, the priorities, and the virtues of Jesus. For as long as I can remember, I'm telling you, I've been reminding people that without a relationship with Jesus, this life is a fantasy at best and a crapshoot at worst. So the Hebrew scriptures of the Old Testament, basically the story of God's people, BC, before Christ, the story of the nation Israel, the people of God who were chosen by God to announce his redemptive plan to their world. This relationship between God and Israel goes all the way back. I mentioned it a few moments ago in the baptism service. It goes back to Genesis chapter 12. God established this covenant relationship with Abraham. God placed tremendous responsibilities on Abraham and his descendants. And God said, I will exchange your faithfulness with my favor. But no matter how great God's blessings were, the people would somehow, they would get frustrated and they would start to turn away from God. And it was absolutely amazing that God didn't just, I wonder sometimes when I read the Old Testament, the Hebrew scriptures, why didn't God just shut the door once and for all? Why didn't God say, I'm done with you people, I'm gonna start all over? But God is steadfast and resolute. Let's go to 2 Kings. We'll be in, I'll show you in a minute. The year was 930 BC. The people of Israel have decided that they don't want to listen to the Old Testament prophets anymore. Obedience was treated as, they said, you people are obsolete. The compliance that you're calling for is old-fashioned. That sound familiar to anybody in here? God is never inclined to force himself on any of us. He's okay about taking his hands off of us and walking away. There might be some people in this service right now with that same attitude. Maybe you didn't even want to be here today. Could be a spouse has been pressing on you for a fresh start. Maybe it was a friend who's just been bugging you, like, why don't you come to church with me sometime? Or possibly maybe there was a really cute boy or a girl at school and they invited you to come. Or maybe it was a persistent coworker who's been after you. And the only way you finally decided, the only way I'm gonna get this person to stop talking about it is just to show up. So you showed up and here you are, first time. But you may not be sitting there like this with your arms folded on the outside, but you're doing that on the inside. You're not gonna listen. No, sir. No, sir, buddy. You're not gonna listen, not really. And you're definitely not gonna conform. No way. You're not gonna play the game. No, sir. You don't wanna have anything to do with God, Bible, church, Christians, or anything. Hey, look, you can relax about that because God is he's never gonna shove himself on you, and neither will we. It's not our strategy, it's not our style. You can walk away from God, so can I. We have the privilege of walking with Christ if we choose. But if we walk away from the plans and the purposes of God, we also walk away from his protection, provisions, and the wisdom of God. And that's what we're going to read about here in 2 Kings. These people say, we're done. We don't want anything to do with God, so they turned and walked away. In fact, in 1 Kings, in chapter 20, and we're going to read about this guy named Ben-Hadad. About that time, King Ben-Hadad of Aram mobilized his army, supported by the chariots and horses of 32 other kings. They went to lay siege on Samaria, the capital of Israel, and launched attacks against him. There was this enemy king, Ben-Hadad. He decides to attack the people of God, Israel, in the town of Samaria. And since the Samaritans have already turned their backs on God, they had also forfeited his protection. So the enemy laid siege. I love that, don't you? Now what that really means is they surrounded the city, but laid siege just sounds better. They laid siege. You know, like we're gonna siege this place. Sounds good. Pretty soon, so they got the city of Samaria surrounded. Pretty soon the food supplies were getting desperately low. So now these people have two choices. They can surrender to their enemy, or they can starve to death. So They start doing some of the most, I would never read, I don't think I would ever read these verses out loud from this platform. They started doing some of the most reprehensible things that you could ever imagine because they were starving to death. Use your imagination or go read it for yourself. But you want to know what I've observed? Those times when we have just walked away from God and done our own thing, the potential for sin to take over our lives begins to increase exponentially. In fact, now I'm talking just about me, but I might be talking about you. Every single stupid, immoral, careless, and reckless thing I have ever done in my life was always, every single time, a violation of God's word. Every time. Is that true for you? Don't answer. Let me illustrate that. I remember I had an experience that I had maybe 20 years ago. I spent one whole day with a couple that I had come to love and respect a lot. This man had violated his marriage vows. The wife's pain was inconsolable. There was anger and tension in that house so thick you could cut it with a knife. Here was this young husband and father. He was a Christian, follower of Christ, but he had obviously walked away from God and he had deserted his marriage vows. And at one point in that conversation, and I was there for hours that day, this wife, just overcome with anguish, she turned to her husband and she said to him with toxic and lethal rage, "You made yourself your own little God, didn't you? You thought that somehow you were above the boundaries and margins of God." And you know something? She was right. That's exactly what he had done. Almost cost him everything. Fortunately, he came to his senses. Believe me, when we turn our backs on God, our potential for sin-filled behavior it goes off the charts. Here's my point. When you walk away from God, disregard his word, refuse to follow his teaching, stop praying, stop seeking God's plan for your life, you will be capable of doing some of the most foolish, outrageous things that you always said you'd never do. Just happens. There's some people in this church right now involved in some reckless lifestyle choices, relational choices that have no future, maybe some decisions at work that are shady at best. There are people in this church today and they never thought they would be where they are now. And the reason they're in the ditch is largely because they decided to walk away from God. Now, most of the time, we don't just drift that way into sin and depravity. I'm not saying it can't happen, but most of the time it's not like that. I mean, we turn our backs on God. We do it on purpose. And then we begin to forfeit his protection and his favor, and that's the story that we're going to read here in the Hebrew scriptures. There are thousands of people in this city that will get up out of bed tomorrow. They will go about their daily life, but I'm telling you, hopelessness is just chopping their heart into little pieces. And you want to know why? For many of them, it's going to be because this moral compass, their moral compass, has stopped working. They don't have godly direction any longer because they've ignored this. So they just start drifting. And many times, local churches, I'm talking about life-saving stations, sometimes we act like we don't even care that people's lives, some of which we know, they're just slipping and sliding toward the weeds and are about to self-destruct, and we miss the urgency of what God is up to in this world. Let me illustrate. The last time you were on a commercial airline flight and you sat in your seat and you buckled your seatbelt, and then one of the flight attendants started reviewing the safety procedures. Bye. It happens when you have two, doesn't it, Nick? Yeah, two. That's right. So you buckle, the flight attendant starts to go over the safety procedures. Have you ever looked around and paid attention to how many people are totally ignoring the professional? Happens It happens to people every week in real life. We get so used to not paying attention to the alarms in life, so when somebody gets up on a stage like this and the veins pop out in his neck and he says with greatest urgency, there are thousands of people across this city whose lives are hopelessly crumbling and many of them are facing a crisis eternity. There's some people that will sit in this room totally ignoring what the person up front is saying, or maybe even start whispering to the person beside them, where do you want to go for lunch? Or they'll be answering their Instagram. I get that. This book has answers to just about everything in life. How to maintain a strong marriage. How to up your chances of raising your kids in a great way. Money management, generosity, how to overcome habits and bad habits and addictions. How to harness our anger and cope with failure. How to reconcile broken relationships and thousands of more things. And yet a large majority of people in this community could care less. They're not paying attention. They don't want to hear it. How many people who claim to be Christians go weeks, sometimes months, maybe even years, and they never crack open this book? Never think about it. Even though the information in this book, it is the most time-tested, reliable blueprint in the history of the world for how to get life right. And we never read it. Some people. Thousands of people across this city, many of whom you know, and they are desperate and they don't have any hope that life is ever going to get better. And so we've got our hands full when it comes to becoming a life-saving center. 2 Kings chapter 7. Now remember, Ben-Hadad, who is the king of the Iranians, they have come to attack the city of Samaria, and now so the people are inside the city and they've got the city surrounded, they laid siege, and there's some life-threatening food shortage. Here's, this is Aramean, and so they're attacking right here. This is Israel, as you know. Now there were 4 men with leprosy sitting at the entrance to the city gates, that is Samaria. Why should we sit here waiting to die? They asked each other. We will starve if we stay here, and we will starve if we go back into the city. So we might as well go out and surrender to the Aramean army. If they let us live, so much better, but if they kill us, we would have died anyway. These people say, the worst thing can happen to us is if we surrender to the enemy and they kill us. But if we stay here, we're going to die pretty soon anyway. So they say, we don't need to keep living this way. Well, what are they going to do? Let me tell you, if there's something that has laid siege to your life, if there is something that has surrounded you and you don't see an escape plan, I've got some good news. For example, if you become a hostage to some type of addictive behavior, and that addiction has surrounded you and it's about to destroy you, it might be substance abuse that has you hopelessly strung out most days. It could be addiction to pornography or gambling. It might be an eating disorder. Perhaps it's wrecking you, disrupting your relational world. Maybe you don't even wonder if there's ever a day that's going to be better. Sometimes guilt and shame from our past lays siege to us and surrounds us, and we just can't figure out how to press through it. The good news is you don't have to live this way another day. God will forgive whatever is threatening to unravel your life. Freedom sometimes is a decision away. There's not an addiction that God can't help you conquer. I mean, if you're thinking, man, I can't overcome mine, contact me this week. I'll introduce you to some people who used to be prisoners, and today they're shouting freedom. Their chains are gone. There's not a sin that God won't forgive. There's not an ounce of guilt that cannot be overcome. You don't have to live the way you're living, not another week, not even another day, if something is not working for you. Look at God's promises. God has taken our sins away as far as the east is from the west. You know how far that is? No, you don't, because you can't figure it out. It's a long way. God says, I am the one who blots out your sin. Isaiah 43, I will not remember them. I'm not going to hold it against you, God says. I will offer you forgiveness. There are people all across this community, and they are up to their eyeballs in some difficult life issues. But for many of them, it never has occurred to them that possibly Jesus could be a part of the solution. Or maybe Jesus is a better way to do life. And there are even fewer of those people who would consider that the church might be a part of the answer. In fact, many of them are convinced that if they ever walked into a church because of their lifestyle or some of the decisions they've made, they'd never be accepted. They'd be made to feel uncomfortable. You know what the tragedy of that is? There are people who desperately need somebody who cares enough just to get up alongside of them and say to them, you know, you don't have to keep living this way. That someone could and should be us, a life-saving station. Another thing that I would never want you to forget is that the work of forgiveness and redemption and life change, that work is in God's hands. I mean, we're just the conduit to make it happen. Let me see if an illustration will help you. Do you know what's really cool about this ice cream? I didn't make it. I didn't pay for it. It was just delivered to my house, and then I gave it away. Now, I was the person who could have chosen to eat it. And this is the story of redemption. Let me explain that. Salvation is all about just reaping the benefits of what Jesus accomplished on the cross for us. Somebody else paid for it. Let me show you. Let's keep reading. So that evening, that is the lepers, they're sitting outside the city and they're thinking, well, if we surrender, we die. If we stay, we die. They went out to the camp of the Arameans, but no one was there. So they go out to where the enemy has the place around. Nobody was there. For the Lord had caused the whole army of Arameans to hear the clatter of speeding chariots and the galloping of horses and the sounds of a great army approaching. This is like a Steven Spielberg movie. I mean, think about it. They're out here camped and they're getting ready to finish off the Samaritans, and suddenly they hear the sounds of chariots and horses and huge armies. You got to love God's strategy. The king of Israel, here's what they say to each other. The king of Israel has hired Egyptians to attack us. So they panicked and fled in the night, abandoning their tents, horses, donkeys, and everything else, and they fled for their lives. That is so cool. Can you imagine these Arameans, and they're out there just waiting for the death sentence, and they're going to take over the city, and then they say, what is that we hear? And they hear this large army coming to attack them, and they start running around in a frenzy. They're totally freaking out, and so they take off. Now watch this. These lepers have decided to surrender to the Arameans. So they're walking out to the Aramean camp. They're going to surrender. They're going to throw in the towel, but they don't know that God has already moved a step ahead of them. And you know what they're thinking? These people they're either going to kill us or turn us into slaves. I know people, and you do too, who think the same thing spiritually. They believe that if they start following Christ, that relationship is going to make them slaves to a whole bunch of religious rules. Hey, guess what? We're in slavery now, y'all, if we don't turn toward Christ. We all know some people for whom it can't get any worse. But I'm amazed at how many people still have this warped idea of God that somehow, if we surrender to God, he's going to make us miserable. Back to the story. These lepers, now they're on the way out to the enemy camp. They're going to surrender. Their future is shattered. They have no hope. But what they don't know is that God has already moved a step ahead of them. So when these lepers, when they walk out there into the enemy camp and they're waving their white flags. They realize there's nobody there. Has God already done something? Has he already made the enemy ineffective? And they're thinking, well, we could never deserve this. But look at how they respond. When the lepers arrived at the edge of the camp, they went into one tent after another, eating, drinking wine, and carrying out silver and gold and clothing and hiding it, stockpiling it. Can you believe that? Just a few minutes before this, these guys were thinking, we're done. And now they're on the receiving end of this unheard of blessing from God. And instead of going back to Samaria to share the good news and the hope they found, they start pilfering as much as they can and start carrying it off for themselves. But haven't we sometimes done the same thing? God ambushes us with amazing grace and then says, I want you to reach as many people as you can with the good news. I don't want you to squirrel it away. Why would you do that? But sometimes we can get really selfish, can't we? Listen, there are people all across this community, and they look pretty good on the outside. Their life appears to be on cruise control, but on the inside, boy, I'll tell you, these people are spiritually empty. They have challenges every day with nowhere to turn. It never occurs to them. They might drive up and down this road 21 times every day, and it never occurs to them that the answers and the solution to their issues might be somehow tucked in a message that reverberates from this church. Some of them have already stepped on a couple of relational landmines, and those things just blew up in their face. Maybe they can't find jobs. Others of them don't have the money to make ends meet. They're single moms all across this community. Some are working 2 jobs. They're just trying to keep up the increasing demands of finding the resources to keep that single mom family from sinking. There's an emerging generation of young adults all across this community. I'm talking about people in their 20s. But right now, there are so many things out of whack in this world. They can't get their hands and their hearts around it, and they become more and more cynical about life and God and the future. I think about some of the teenagers growing up around here, and if given the chance, some of those kids would be open to the possibility of a relationship with God. Some of those kids, there are teenagers all across this community, and some of those young emerging adults would be open to the possibility that a prevailing church might have something for them. God designed the church to be a place where we can come and learn about the protective boundaries of God. But when churches become careless or indifferent or selfish, and when we turn our backs on some of the people that God would just love to get his arms around, that's trouble. For example, some of you will go out to eat after this service. Makes sense. And some of you will be tempted to be a little over-concerned or even vocal about having to wait for 15 minutes, or maybe the quality or the quantity of the food. And you know what you could do? You could focus on the person who's serving you. When we become followers of Jesus, we forfeit our right to be rude. We don't have the right any longer to be offensive and disrespectful. That's why I've said it a bunch of times. If you are determined that road rage is going to get the best of you and you're going to flip people off, at least be sensitive enough to not put the SMC sticker on the back of your car. I heard about a Sunday school teacher. Yeah, you remember back when we were kids, maybe it was just my generation, when we were kids, but we learned a little chorus a long time ago, "This little light of mine." Y'all remember that? "This little light of mine." And we used to do this in the church where I grew up. "This little light of mine, I'm going to let it shine." And then there was a second verse, and it said, "This little light of mine, hide it under a bushel." And we used to do like this, "Hide it under a bushel." No, we would say, "No, don't hide it. Well, this Sunday school teacher, she's going over the song, and when she gets to the second verse, this little girl in the class said, "Hide it under a bushel? Hell no." Well, I mean, she had the message right, just a little bit sideways. I mean, but you got to love that little girl's passion and her heart. Now, here's the deal. Now, watch this. For the past 10 minutes, I've been talking about people in this community, all over this community, tens of thousands of them, who are facing desperate days and hopeless nights and the possibility of a Christless eternity someday. And some of you are more concerned that I said hell in church. It's time we started majoring on the majors. Finally, they said to each other in verse 9, they had a wake-up call. This is not right. This is wonderful news. And remember, they were stockpiling all the goods and stuff. We aren't sharing it with anyone. Come on, let's go back and tell the people, they say, what God has done. They finally realize that they have more stuff than they already need. The people in Samaria, in their own town, they're hungry and desperate and living in fear. So they say, we can't just stockpile this stuff. We got to go back and we've got to take the good news that we have and squarely lay it into the hands of the people back in hometown. And there was a kind of urgency in that. And here's why. I don't know if you figured it out yet or not. Listen carefully, but everybody's not going to heaven. Have you allowed yourself to somehow over the years kind of be deceived, and now you're sleepwalking, thinking that maybe at the end of the race, God is just going to curve all the grades? And that he'll turn his head and say, wave everybody in. That's a great thought, isn't it? But it totally eliminates the need for the cross. How would you like to meet up with Jesus one day and say, hey, Jesus, I hate it for you, man. I hate you had to endure the cross because we were all getting in anyway. We cannot be content until people across this community know what we know about Jesus. But it's not our job to change anybody. Let me illustrate that. If I walk onto this stage and I recommend a book or a movie or a flavor of ice cream or a restaurant or a church or, even Jesus, you don't have to take my recommendations for any of that. It's not my job to convince you. Our responsibility is just to tell as many people in this community what we already know about the irresistible love of Christ. If you share Christ with somebody and that person blows you off, it's not about you. Don't fret about that. They're not turning their back on you. They're turning their backs on God. It's not your responsibility to transform a human heart. So they went back to the city and told the gatekeepers what had happened, that they had gone out to the Aramean camp and no one was there. Then the gatekeeper shouted the news to the people in the palace. The king got out of bed in the middle of the night and told his officers, I know what has happened. The Arameans know we are starving, so they have left their camp and have hidden in the fields. He can't even believe it. They are expecting us to leave the city, and then they will take us alive and capture the city. I just want you to know now he was in an influential position. That's what one negative person can do. Do you know any cynical people who just suck the air right out of a room? I've never known a church that didn't have a couple stubborn people in it. I mean, they're going to throw cold water on anything, everything. Look, if you decide that your job is to sabotage what goes on around here on the weekend, would you please at least save it till Monday? Yeah, it's not very helpful when somebody walks up to me in the lobby between the services and decides to be my personal Holy Spirit and to make sure that I understand you forgot to do that, or you forgot to say that, or you made a mistake when you read that scripture. Oh, trust me, it doesn't help me. Monday is better. Back to the story. The skeptics, one of the officers said, we'd better send out scouts. We better send some scouts out. Let them take 5 of the remaining horses. If something happens to them, it won't be a greater loss. Now it stinks to be one of those 5, but So 2 chariots with horses were prepared, and the king sent scouts to see what had happened to the Aramaean army. They went all the way to the Jordan River, following a trail of clothing and equipment that the Aramaeans had thrown away in their mad rush to escape. The scouts returned and told the king about it. Then the people of Samaria rushed out to the Aramaean camp and carried off what was left. Now let me tell you, if God can do that 3,000 years ago, what could God do with a couple thousand of us? Don't tell me that God can't use this church to reach this community with help and hope and promise. Not only can it happen, but it must happen. And we decided a long time ago, we're not going to rest until we all pick up the baton and start to do our job, fulfill our responsibility in the redemptive plan of God. Last Sunday night, Susan and I attended the high school program. It was amazing. The games were fun. Dozens of kids, I guess 100, maybe more, were engaged. Sean's message, spot on. Volunteers and the small group leaders were bouncing all over the place with enthusiasm. I didn't try the pizza, but it looked pretty good. The whole thing just looked pretty good. On the way home, now I'd had a pretty exhausting weekend. And I was thinking, man, I'm so glad to be a part of a church that just pours tons of energy and resources into kids because, in about 20 years, some of those wacky acting teenagers will be leading the church. I don't know of anything that we ever do that's more important to you. And then this past Wednesday night, I was leaving SMC, the end of the workday, and there were a half a dozen young families gathered out there in the atrium or in the lobby, and they were getting ready to start a small group marriage study. And they said, we got 15 of our kids back in the children's space. You want to go back there and take care of them for us? In fact, the kids started coming out, and they were begging. They said, come on, Pastor Bob, you can come back here and you can eat pizza with us. When I got home, I told Susan, I said, you know something? Those children, all between the ages of 0 and about 12. They have no idea, do they? The foundation their parents are laying down for their future. Let me tell you why. Almost 60 years ago, a church in Philadelphia, listen carefully, watched 3 9-year-old boys get baptized and join the church. Not too long after that church was facing some dwindling membership and diminishing resources, so they sold the building and they closed the doors for the last time, and they disbanded their small church. One of those 3 boys was author and pastor Tony Campolo. The second little boy grew up and became a missionary serving in India. And the third kid became a seminary professor using his influence with up and coming church leaders and pastors. Tony Campolo he does a lot of research. And so he thought, a few years ago, he thought, I'm going to go back and do some research. So he started combing through the church archives of his boyhood church. And he found the annual report for the same year that he and his buddies were baptized. Do we have that? Here's what it was in the record. It has not been a good year for our church. We lost 27 members. 3 were baptized, but they were only children. Never underestimate what these kids running around this place are going to eventually do one day for kingdom causes. For the past 160 plus years, one of the birthmarks of this church is that we are totally sold out to the next generation. And we're doing the best we can to make it happen. Look at this image. Those are all the faces of the children, teenagers, that were baptized on August 29th. And I could point to, look at that kid's face right there. This kid's got his thumb up. Like, where's some others? Like, look at this. Look at that. And the smile on that kid's face. Look at her. She may rock the kingdom world one of these days. Isn't that amazing? It's never too late, is it? I was thinking that it would be a stingy thing. It would have been a stingy thing this week for me to not share my Graeter's ice cream. You agree? I gave it away. But imagine how much worse if I refused to share the amazing grace that more than 52 years ago saved this 17-year-old teenager. It's not going to happen. That's why I love you, SMC.